Hi, Michelle, can you hear me? Michelle, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Counselor.
Okay, so you can see me, I can't see myself, right?
I can also see you.
Can you see yourself now, Counselor?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, so we're just keeping the screen share up for recording purposes.
Okay.
So we'll take the screen share away once you're getting ready to start.
All right. Let's see. In terms of, I only ask because I'm using a new device. I can't click on participants. Is that on purpose? That's fine if it's, I just want to make sure it's all intentional and that it's not my new device.
You should be able to, because I made you a co-host.
Okay.
So you should be able to access those features.
Okay. Let me see. I'll turn off video for a little bit.
Morning, Lydia and Michelle.
Morning, Counselor. I can hear you.
How you doing, all right?
Good.
Hope you had a good Labor Day weekend.
I did, thank you. Hope you did too.
Yeah, kids are back to school, so it's a little hectic.
Have we disabled the video? Oh no. Okay. Good. Trying a new device today. Frank Baker told me I need to step up my game.
Hi, it's Julia. I just wanted to let you know I was in the room. If anyone can hear me. I see people in the house. Who knows?
Michelle, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm not able to even click on start video.
Hi, Lydia. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Good morning.
Morning.
Counselor, are you still having that difficulty?
Yeah, can you see me?
So I see the main screen that Candace has up to start right now. And now I see your name, but not your video. It looks like your video's off.
I'm trying, yeah, the button for some reason is not clicking on. Like, you hear me? There we go.
Well, I can see you now.
Okay. All right. I'm just gonna make sure.
Can you see me, Lydia?
Yep.
Am I on here? Can you see me?
Yep.
Morning, Madam Chair.
Hi, Kenzie. I am not seeing the participants for some reason.
Oh, look at Mr.
I can't see who the participants are for some reason, so I don't know. Here we go. All right.
Lydia froze on my screen. I don't know. Did she freeze in yours, Flynn? Flynn.
Can you hear me,
Counselor
Julie?
Flynn, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you check to see Lydia? Lydia looks frozen. Is she frozen on your side too? Or is it just
she's frozen. She's frozen for us too.
Yeah, I'm frozen when I go to participants. So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Lydia.
Okay, then that's okay. I just needed to make sure I got see who's here and who the guest speakers are, because we'll get started as soon as I see that everyone is here. Andrea and Ricardo. Waiting on them, unless they're in the attendees list. Okay, Andrea's here, Denise's here.
Thanks, Counselor.
Yep. I'm just waiting on Ricardo. I'll just have all the.
You have me right, Lydia?
Yep, I have, well, I have on the list Ricardo, Julia, Andrea as the co-sponsors, and they can decide, I guess, who wants to go first. Ed, Mike, Kenzie, Liz, Anissa.
Morning.
Hi. All right, it's 11:02. Someone want to text Ricardo? We'll just go ahead. Oh.
I'll ping him now, Counselor Edwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just got the order of arrival, so I'm going to put that in there. So.
Madam Chair?
Yes?
We haven't started yet, right?
Nope.
Candace, I'm having trouble logging in from the laptop. It's just spinning around. So now I'm on my phone. Oh, wait, there it is. All right, I'm going to log off. Here.
Oh. All right. Well, it's 11:03. Back. Ricardo, have you joined us? All right. Because we have a full lineup of folks with about 4 panels, and I'm sure there's going to be public testimony. I want to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and do some introductory remarks, introduce my colleague. We have a letter from the administration, and then we'll get right to our panelists. So good morning, everyone. I am City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations, Tuesday, September 8th, 2020. And we are here today for a virtual hearing on docket 0885, ordinance establishing a civilian review board within the city of Boston. The matter was sponsored by Councilors Andrea Campbell, Ricardo Arroyo, and Julia Mejia, and was referred to the committee on July 29th, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 executive order modifying certain requirements for the open meeting law, we are able to have this meeting on Zoom. That allows us to balance public health needs along with being able to do our jobs, essentially. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV. Will also be rebroadcasted at a later date on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made part of the record. This docket would establish a civilian review board for the city of Boston, and that would investigate complaints of police misconduct and internal affairs investigations and recommend disciplinary actions for police officers, BPD policies, procedures, and practices, excuse me. The ordinance lays out a board structure, member appointment, the establishment of a budgeted office for staff support, required trainings, powers and duties, processes and procedures for review of complaints and investigations, and public access and reporting requirements. As a reminder, we have a hard stop at 2, but we're going to try and get it closer to 1 for another council hearing. The Committee on Ways and Means, for example, today is holding a hearing regarding police contracts and police documents. So if there are, for example, some questions that are more apropos for that hearing later on, I will notify the person questioning them and remind them that they can ask those questions again at a later time. I will now going to introduce my colleagues who have joined us in order of arrival. First, the lead sponsors, Councillor Andrea Campbell, Councillor Ricardo Arroyo, and Councillor Julia Mejia, followed by Councillor Flaherty, Councillor Braden, Councillor Mejia, Councillor Bach, Councillor Flynn, Councillor Sabi George, Councillor Janey, and that's who I have so far. Any other colleagues join me that I have not mentioned? Okay, and just wanted to note as well that we are going to be joined by the administration, but only in terms of taking notes and listening. The administration has written a letter to the committee that I will now read. Dear Chairwoman Edwards, thank you for the invitation to testify at today's hearing on docket 0885. Following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and subsequent demonstrations in Boston and throughout the nation, Mayor Walsh created a new task force to review policies and protocols in the Boston Police Department. This task force is made up of an independent group of community members and chaired by former U.S. Attorney of the District of Massachusetts, Wayne Budd. The task force is charged with reviewing and making recommendations to strengthen Boston's existing police review board, known as the Community Ombudsman Oversight Panel, or Co-op Board. While the task force continues to meet with community members and other stakeholders, it is developing recommendations to strengthen the co-op board in addition to other important topics in police reform. These recommendations will guide us as we continue to make changes throughout the police department. The ordinance being discussed today requires significant discussion and analysis. Members of the administration will be watching the hearing and listening to councilors and other stakeholders' thoughts on the proposed legislation. The city's law department is reviewing the proposed ordinance, and we will be working to fill any information requests that come out of the hearing. We look forward to learning more about the proposal and working collaboratively to address these important issues. Thank you again for the invitation to testify. We look forward to reviewing the hearing. Neil Doherty from Intergovernment Relations. Neil is here taking notes, and again, we'll be following up on any questions that we specifically have. Thank you, and with that, I'm going to turn it over, because of our time crunch, for very, very brief opening remarks from the co-sponsors. And then I would like to get to the, if any of my colleagues have, again, very brief opening remarks, then we need to get to the panelists. So at this point, I will turn it over to the first lead sponsor, Councillor Andrea Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my council colleagues, of course, and thank you to all of the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. This ordinance is to establish a civilian review board in the city of Boston, a body independent from the Boston Police Department, to review and investigate complaints of police misconduct and internal affairs investigations, recommend disciplinary actions and applicable changes to the department's policies, procedures, and practices, and regularly publish data on these cases, as well as police stops, arrests, and department demographics, all with the goal to provide true accountability, to increase transparency, and to shift policies, practices, and culture so we don't continue to create or perpetuate racial disparities in our policing system. There are many misconceptions out there regarding the role of the mayor's task force, suggesting at moments that this body is not looking to work in partnership. The council, including my predecessor, Councillor Yancey, along with residents and advocates, have for decades been leading the conversation on creating a civilian review board. And for numerous reasons, including opposition from administrations, unions, and some council colleagues, that has not happened. Over the last few years, I've filed 3 hearing orders and have had several conversations internally about the importance of establishing this board, all of which were either ignored by the administration or dismissed as a topic not worth discussing. While I applaud the work of the task force and of course value the members of that task force tremendously, The mayor has had numerous opportunities to partner with me and this body, as well as former co-op panelists, to make this happen. And yes, it is sad that it has taken the loss of George Floyd and many others to get to this moment where we even have a mayor's task force to look at policing reforms, and for folks in City Hall or in the media and in the city and in the media to take this proposal seriously. This legislation would be a big step for the city of Boston in transforming a board that has been ineffective in providing police accountability. And still no one from the administration, sadly, is here to actually weigh in, to take a position or to give feedback in real time. The ordinance, which of course our Madam Chair has spoken to, creates a new board to replace the existing co-op, which with broader authority and resources to make it stronger and more effective than the co-op, by creating independence from the police department with appointments by both the council and the mayor, broader authority to investigate complaints of police misconduct, subpoena power, power to issue disciplinary recommendations consistent with disciplinary guidelines established with the commissioner and collective bargaining limitations. It also it also establishes ways to file complaints both in person, online, by phone, taking into account language access. It also allows our police officers and personnel to file complaints through the board. It calls for continual data collection and transparency. It establishes an office which will be resourced and staffed. And lastly, requires the board to hold regular public meetings and opportunities for community engagement. Our ordinance incorporates best practices from other civilian oversight boards across the country, including New York, Atlanta, Oakland. And we'll hear from folks who have been members of civilian review boards to share what they think is effective in other municipalities. As folks look to reallocate resources from the police department, including from its over $70 million overtime budget, to community-based initiatives that better address root causes of violence, I support that, while also creating an effective apparatus, which we currently do not have, that creates accountability in instances of wrongdoing and allows folks to come forward and file a complaint. This is an initial draft, and I have already received constructive feedback from our unions, all of them, including our policing associations, our district attorney, advocates, members of the public, that will lead to edits, and I appreciate the continued feedback that comes in. I have stressed this before, but establishing this civilian review board is not about individual officers, many of whom I value as my constituents and hardworking public servants, but about a system that has not served and protected all of us equally. And the policing reforms have always been about making our department more transparent, diverse, racially just, and accountable. This is indeed a moment in time with a new council, a movement of residents demanding reforms and advocates also weighing in. And thus the council, of course, will continue to lead. And I feel very proud to be partnering with Councilors Arroyo and Mejia to finally get this done. Thank you again, Madam Chair. Thank you to my colleagues. And again, thank you to all of the panelists for showing up today.
Thank you. Councilor Arroyo, very brief introductory remarks, and then Councilor Mejia.
I didn't hear back from Councilor Arroyo. I did ping him, so I haven't heard back just yet. He could be running a little bit behind.
Okay, Councilor Mejia, very brief introductory remarks.
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You might be seeing me twice just because I'm having internet issues, but so thank you to the chair and thank you to my co-sponsors, Councilor Campbell and Arroyo, for all that you're doing in the public safety space. People have been calling for a civilian review board in cities across the country longer than any of us have been alive. So I don't plan on spending any of our time questioning on whether or not we need this. The fact of the matter is that we know what we know. The question is what are we going to be doing? What are we going to do about it? What I am going to focus on is to focus on the process, because unless we get this right and we lead with the people, this is just going to be another layer of government that our people will either fight to get attention from or just flat out ignore. I will say that while this hearing is important, we need to be more intentional about getting out into our community and consulting with them and letting them lead. Our job as leaders is to respond to the calls for action from our people. And we know, and we need to put ourselves in the position of where they have the power to lead on this issue. Government is at an all-time low, particularly around trust, and sometimes for good reason. the administration, as Councilor Campbell has noted, has failed to and declined to participate today. So we need to be sure that whether we end up with whatever we end up with is not only effective, but also accountable to the people, and that this is their civilian review board. I think it's really disheartening that here, I mean, I'm a first-term counselor, but I'm not new to this conversation. And the fact that we've been having this and pushing for this for as long as I can remember, and hearing activists out in these streets pushing for this, the fact that it took, you know, George Floyd and the civil unrest to kind of like say, oh yeah, we're gonna do something about it now. Where were you before? You know, it's like Janet Jackson, what have you done for me lately? At the end of the day, the bottom line is we can't continue to be all about reactive politics. We need to be proactive. And these times require us to think before situations go down. And so I am looking forward to being engaged in this dialogue, and more importantly, holding myself accountable to those who put me in office. So here we go. Thank you for having me, and looking forward to the theatrics.
Thank you. So we're going to go now to my colleagues for a very, very brief comment to introduce, or feel free to waive them so we can get to one of the 4 panelists that we have before we get to public testimony. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for hosting and chairing today, as well as to the sponsors, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Arroyo, and Councilor Mejia. Thank others, panelists, for participating as well. And would obviously like to do a little deeper dive in the existing community ombudsman oversight panel, just hear from folks as to sort of what they think the deficiencies are and how we could strengthen that, given that we currently have something there available on the books. If it's not working, why is it not working? Or are there things that we can be doing to help give it you know, the tools that it needs to be effective if folks think that it's ineffective. I know that complaints are down, and they've been going down arguably probably since the body cameras have been installed, but I also know that the panel has asked to do more and to maybe increase the percentages of cases they handle. So I would really love to hear, maybe Larry Mays could be best to speak to some of that in terms of how it currently works, and you know, how we can make it better. Thank you, Madam Chair. And good to see you, Larry.
Councilor Braden.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm going to keep my comments very brief. I look forward to learning more about how we can improve the process. I know that from speaking to a predecessor of mine, that this ordinance to establish a civilian review board for the police department has been something we've been looking for a very, very, very long time. So I look forward to hearing the conversation this morning, and thank you for chairing this meeting. And thank you to the makers for bringing this issue forward.
Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to thank the makers. Sam's strongly supportive of a civilian review board. I've done a bunch of research on the history going back a century, sadly, that we've been having this fight. And I will forego the rest of my comments in the interest of the afternoon hearing that I'm chairing. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Councillor Wu as well. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Arroyo, Councillor Mejia for sponsoring this ordinance, and for Councillor Edwards for chairing the hearing. Like some of my colleagues mentioned, I'm here to learn more about this and the experiences of other municipalities across the country that implemented a civilian review board. I believe that our Boston police do an exceptional job. They are highly trained, educated workforce and responsive. I frequently do public safety walkthroughs with neighborhood residents across District 2 with the police. And I know the residents have great faith in the police as well. But if there are complaints or calls for misconduct, they should be investigated appropriately, and there should be accountability and transparency during these investigations as well. Looking forward to hearing the testimony from stakeholders about how a civilian review board can potentially impact our city, our police, and how we can all learn from each other, especially from cities that may have this type of review board as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the makers and our guests who are with us this morning. For the needs of time, I'm just going to ditto and echo what my colleagues have said and look forward to this hearing and participating in the dialogue this morning and going forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Janey.
Thank you so much. Just briefly, I want to thank the makers. As everyone has already mentioned, this is a very important issue, one that this body has been trying to push for decades, and it's sad that we've just getting here now. I'm very supportive, 110%, which is why it is included in the letter to the mayor outlining the Black and Brown agenda. Disappointed that the administration is not here, because one of the things I was really hoping to gather from this hearing was the lessons and challenges from the co-op board. So not hearing from the administration with specifics around that is disappointing, but looking forward to a productive hearing. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the makers.
Councillor Wu.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and to the sponsors and everyone for being part of this. I just wanted to echo a lot of what has been said in noting that, you know, now is a time where we need to stop saying that Boston is exceptional or different or separate from conversations that are happening across the country. We know on the community side that every incident of trauma that we see, even if it's outside our city borders and on the other side of the country, spills over into our residents' trauma here. And therefore, we need to reinforce just how important accountability is, and for us to be taking every possible step in Boston. On this civilian review board in particular, I think the importance is to note we're not just talking about the direct accountability that comes from having people who are independent and with the power to review cases and allegations, but even the act of having a structure that people know is there, that lifts up the channel for folks to be able to reach out and to be able to address incidents of misconduct. That in and of itself builds trust in a way that's really important and foundational for public safety and public health in general. So the last thing I want to note is that, you know, we've been having this conversation in Boston for a long time. And so shout out to many, many activists who have been pushing for this and whose efforts, frankly, have led to the creation of the co-op board. There are many different potential structures for a civilian review board across the country. I want to thank one of my summer fellows, Robert Gibson, for doing a lot of research on that. So looking forward to understanding the specific contours of how this will fit into Boston's existing resources and move us in the direction of accountability and trust. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just briefly state as chair, I look forward to a robust conversation. I do believe this is something that we can do if necessary, and we should be able with all hands to create the most transparent, accountable institution that is balancing both the practical needs of the police officers with the trust and transparency that the public desire. So we're going to go to the first panel. On that panel, I have Representative—
Madam Chair, my name's Skip again, this hearing.
No, and I didn't see, sorry, Councilor Baker.
Will you buy yourself a computer so you can see who's on, please? Do you want me to get one for you?
This is the new device that you told me to go buy. It's the new, you know, I thought you would see that. My apologies, Councilor Baker.
Well, brief comments. I'm just here to listen and see how we make the city better. I do think that the Boston police and more than just the Boston police do good work. I think there's a lot of people in Boston that do good work, and you know, but looking to participate and lend a hand where I can. Thank you.
Thank you. And have I missed any other city councilor? My extreme apologies, Councilor Baker. So again, so we have 4 panelists. We're going to try and move to them right now. On our first panel, we have Representative Russell Holmes. He will join by the NYC Civilian Review Board, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Ms. Alvarez, but Yohaira Alvarez and Jonathan Darsh. Also on this board will be the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, Mr. Brian Kaur, and former member of Boston's Co-op Board, Larry Mays. I'm going to go ahead and have the representative speak first, as it's normally our custom to have our other.
Sorry, he's actually running a little bit behind, so I was planning on going after the NYC Civilian Review Board. Councilor Edwards, you just called me.
Very well. All right, then I understand there's a 15-minute presentation. And so I'm going to have each one of, so the presentation will go, then Brian, you will speak your remarks, then Larry Mays, and if Representative Holmes joins us, they will all speak. And then we will see how we're doing on time for questions. So I'll turn it over to Yohaida Alvarez and Jonathan Darsh.
Good morning. I'd first like to take a moment to thank Councilor Campbell for the invitation to be part of this panel, and to thank Chair Edwards for holding this meeting to discuss the future of police oversight in the city of Boston. As Executive Director of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, it is my great pleasure to join you and share some of what we've been able to learn and accomplish here in New York. I also want to say it's an honor to be on a panel with Brian Kaur. As a leader of the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, Brian has taught me a great deal personally, but also been a resource to the CCRB and the city of New York generally. For context, I think it would be helpful for me to provide some background about the CCRB. The CCRB has existed in New York City for a long time, but it wasn't until 1993 that it took its current form as an independent agency. Today, our agency is the largest independent, all-civilian police oversight entity in the country and has the power to review civilian complaints about the NYPD, the nation's largest police department. The board consists of 15 members. The mayor appoints 5, the city council appoints 5, the police commissioner designates 3, and the public advocate appoints 1. In addition, the chair of the board is appointed jointly by the mayor and the speaker of the New York City Council. The agency is staffed by about 200 people, the majority of whom are investigators. The city charter gives us our jurisdiction, which includes allegations of excessive force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language. We receive about 5,000 complaints a year that fall within that jurisdiction. One aspect that makes the CCRB unique among civilian oversight entities is that it has subpoena power, which enables investigators to obtain records from medical facilities and commercial establishments. This is particularly notable when it comes to obtaining surveillance video footage, as our data has shown that video footage, whether it's surveillance video, cell phone video, or body-worn camera video, has a significant impact on the board's ability to make a determination about what happened during an incident. Another important facet of our board is the administrative prosecution unit, which in the most serious cases of misconduct brings cases against members of the NYPD in administrative hearings, in administrative disciplinary hearings. The unit is made up of about a dozen attorneys and has prosecuted more than 600 officers since its inception in 2013. Most notably, Officer Daniel Pantaleo, who was found guilty of using a fatal chokehold on Eric Garner, was fired from the NYPD last year after the APU prosecutors argued for his termination. One of the elements we're proudest of as an agency is our Youth Advisory Council, which we launched in late 2018. This group of young New Yorkers representing all 5 boroughs of the city has proven to be a source of incredible insight about issues affecting youth. Our most recent issue-based report, a report our policy team published on the relationship between the NYPD and youth, paints a picture of just how much work there is to do on that front in New York. It makes me all the more grateful to have this group of smart, community-oriented young people leading the way forward. From our monthly board meetings, during which everyday New Yorkers share their questions and concerns about policing in New York, to our outreach unit, which meets residents of our city where they are to ensure they know how to report police misconduct, to our recent expansion on social media, the CCRB is in constant pursuit of new, innovative ways to connect with and serve New York City. We are more than happy to help you as you strive to do the same in the city of Boston. Thank you again for this invitation, and I look forward to addressing any questions you may have. And I think Yahira has a few things to add.
Thanks, John. Thank you again, Chair Edwards, Councilor Campbell, Mejia, and Arroyo. I'm going to present a short presentation for you. There you go. And it'll provide a brief overview similar to what John had mentioned, but wanted to provide a little bit additional context. Chair Edwards, are you able to see the screen? Okay, perfect. So as John mentioned, we are the nation's largest independent oversight entity of the largest police force. We are mandated to investigate, mediate, and administratively prosecute complaints of misconduct against members of the NYPD. John mentioned the composition of the board. When talking about it, this has recently changed due to a charter change that was passed overwhelmingly back in November. So our board increased from 13 members to 15. And it is the current composition that John mentioned: 5 by the mayor, 5 by city council, 3 by the police commissioner, 1 by the public advocate. In New York City, the public advocate is an elected position and represents the people's best interest. And the chair is jointly appointed, as John mentioned, by the mayor and the city council. Other things I would like to note that we're the only civilian oversight with the administrative prosecution unit that has an administrative prosecution unit, that the NYPD officers are required by law to provide official statements to us. And really wanted to note that only the police commissioner can impose discipline. Here are some of the laws, the city charter, a memorandum of understanding, and rules that really govern the body. I'll be happy to share that with the counselors if you have additional information. So local city charter, we have the rules posted on our website. We have local, we have state city service law, section 75, and that discusses their statute of limitations and outlines our disciplinary process. The memorandum of understanding is what has, what governs our administrative prosecution unit. And when investigators look at these allegations of misconduct, they are usually using the Fourth Amendment law and the New York City Patrol Guide, which is a text that outlines the duties of the police officer's job and role. Taking a step back, a little bit of the composition of the agency itself. As John mentioned, the agency is composed of 200 civilians, so there are no uniformed officers and no officers or members of service on staff. So we're governed by that 15-member board. One of those members is the chair. Executive the director oversees the general day-to-day procedures, et cetera. So some of the major departments, the investigations unit is obviously our largest, and it's composed of over 100 civilian investigators. They range from rank of level 1, level 2 to level 3. We have supervising investigators. We have managers on different squads that oversee all of the complaints that we receive. We have the APU unit. We also have a director of mediation, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and also departments that oversee our HR department, our IT department, et cetera. We have a general counsel's office. And we have external affairs, which include my department, the Department of Outreach and Intergovernmental Affairs. We have a communications department, and we also have a policy and advocacy department as well. So as was mentioned, we don't investigate all allegations of police misconduct. The 4 major categories are force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language. We use the acronym FATO to share with the public what falls under our jurisdiction. So with force, it's any allegation alleging force. So that can include a punch, a kick, a use of a taser, even a police officer pulling out a weapon and pointing it at me would be something that we would investigate. And we would investigate if that force was excessive or unnecessary, given the totality of the circumstances. Again, we're using that patrol guide to govern that, to determine that. With abuse of authority, that's by far our largest category. It includes everything from an improper stop, allegations of an improper search, a police officer refusing to provide their shield and name upon request, a police officer threatening to call ICE, etc. With discourtesy, we investigate allegations of a police officer using profanity inappropriately or using an inappropriate gesture. For example, if I ask a police officer for their name and badge number, a police officer asks me for my identification, I give it to her. But upon returning that ID, she just throws it on the ground. That's something that we would investigate. And last but not least, offensive language. So this is language that inappropriately refers to my race, my ethnicity, my sexual orientation, my religion, my disability status. We have multiple ways of the public to file a complaint. They can file a complaint by dialing 311, which is a general number for general concerns. And we've reached out to 311 to make sure that they're screening those calls to make sure that the appropriate complaints alleging police misconduct are directed to us. We also have a direct line that operates Monday through Friday, where we have intake specialists who screen those calls to determine if it falls under our jurisdiction, which I'll talk about in a moment. Folks can visit our office. Even in the midst of COVID, we've taken a lot of precautions to ensure the safety of the public and staff, but and also encourage folks, if they are able to go online and file the complaint on our website, they can also file the complaint at their local precinct. And for our equivalent of counselors, our council members, we've teamed with 5 council members in each borough. So before COVID, what we would do is host these CCRB hours where folks can come into a city council member's office and file a complaint. We have an investigator on staff screening that, that complaint and taking that complaint, interviewing civilians, making it a little bit more convenient for them to begin that process, especially if they live far away. So as you know, New York City is composed of 5 boroughs. So with the 5 council members that we partnered with, 1 is stationed in each borough, really helping in that process. And due to recent litigation, we are now able to receive complaints if someone has witnessed misconduct via social media. And that could be via Twitter, YouTube, etc. We accept those types of complaints. So a brief overview of the life of a CCRB case. So that intake specialist speaks to the complainant. They screen that complaint to make sure it falls under FADO, F-A-D-O. If it doesn't, we have a robust referral process. So it could go to NYPD's Internal Affairs or NYPD's Office of the Chief of Department. Or it could be that the intake specialist finds that it's not NYPD at all. It's perhaps a traffic agent or an MTA agent, which is our local subway system. And we will refer that appropriate complaint to the appropriate body. But if it does fall under our jurisdiction, the matter will be sent to investigations and determined if it's eligible for mediation or it could go directly to investigations. For mediation, it's a completely non-disciplinary process. Both parties must agree to it. It is a third party that conducts these mediations. It's a neutral third party. They're completely confidential, and we've received a high level of satisfaction in this process. That is to say that not all allegations of misconduct are eligible for mediation. So for example, if a civilian is alleging that a police officer used excessive force, that isn't something that we would offer to that civilian and obviously direct it directly to investigations. So if it does go to investigations, an overview of that process is that the investigator conducts a robust investigation, produces a closing report, submits that report to a 3-member panel. That board panel is composed of members from different groups of the board. So it could be a mayoral designee, a city council designee, police commissioner designee, et cetera. And if those, and the board has that final disciplinary recommendation. And if they determine that that allegation is severe, it would go to our administrative prosecution unit. So that's an overview of that. Going a little deeper into the investigative process, as was mentioned, we do have subpoena power. So the investigators obtain witness statements, the video footage, photographs of the scene, the victim, injuries. The police officers are are required by law to come in and provide a statement. And we also interview those that are the subject of the complaint, but also any witness officers that were on the scene of the incident. We also have the ability to conduct a photo array for the civilian to determine who the police officer was in that situation. So some of the dispositions that we have, there are 4 major dispositions: substantiated, unsubstantiated, unfounded, and exonerated. We use the preponderance of evidence standard. So for substantiated, that means that there was sufficient credible evidence that misconduct occurred. For unsubstantiated, there's not sufficient credible evidence. So we don't really know exactly what happened. We can't really say that this occurred, that misconduct did or didn't occur. It's unsubstantiated. Unfounded is that, that there was sufficient credible evidence that determined that the officer did not commit the alleged act. And exonerated is that the incident occurred, but the police officer was justified in their actions, either by law or by the patrol guide. So if an allegation is, the disposition is substantiated, there are a range of disciplinary recommendations that the board can issue. So it could range from instruction to charges. So it could also be formalized training or command discipline. So for the more severe disciplinary recommendations, charges and specifications, those are the incidences that go to our administrative prosecution unit. And it was established back in 2013. It independently tries officers for these allegations. As John mentioned, for example, the most notable was the EP trial of former officer Pantaleo. And the prosecutions are not connected to any civil or criminal actions by the NYPD or its officers, which is important to note. We are, again, our own separate process. The trials take place at NYPD headquarters. I'm sorry?
Yes. There's one person who has a hard stop at 12. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have much further or if it would be okay. I think everything you're saying is very pertinent and relevant. Mm-hmm. If we could pause, allow for him to speak and get back to your presentation essentially.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think there's only 2 slides, but yeah, I'll stop it there.
If you only have 2 slides, go ahead and finish. But if not, I didn't want to disrespect the amount of work that went into this and I wanted to come back to you. So go ahead if you have just 2 slides.
Okay. And it's just to wrap up, when talking to the public, what's really important is to really highlight our policy department as well, because folks really want to know, why would I file a complaint if the worst thing that could happen to a police officer is that they lose vacation days or possibly get fired? We really highlight the policy department that could aggregate this data, make policy recommendations, and help the public see any trends in policing. We publish all of our data on our website, which I'll share with you all. We issue 12 reports a year. Most recently was a youth report that focused on police and youth relations. And not only do we focus on police and community relations, we also really want to strengthen the CCRB's relation to the public. So we conduct outreach presentations, hundreds each year. We go to community events. Our board meetings are held in the public in different boroughs. And we ask civilians to come forward and share their insight on what they're seeing in their community and how to better the agency overall. And we'll be happy to answer any questions. Sorry for going a little over.
No, you didn't. And he had a hard stop and that's the only thing. So thank you so much for incredibly informative. We're going to have other people speak and then come back for a robust conversation. So I hope you'll be able to stay on the entire time. Thank you so much for this. And I'm sure Michelle sent out the presentation to all the counselors. That being said, it's actually Yvonne from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. If you have some brief remarks, and then then Representative Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for appreciate that. And I want to also thank you for your leadership, and the makers for their leadership, and all of the city councilors who are with us. It is an honor to be here. I think I also want to thank Johaida Alvarez for that incredible presentation, and it dovetails very nicely. After seeing that presentation, I feel that New York City is light years ahead of us in terms of where we should be with respect to police accountability and oversight. I want to make one thing very clear. At Lawyers for Civil Rights, we not only hold police accountable, we also defend police officers. We sued the Boston Police when we found out about Terrence Coleman's murder, for example. And we defend police officers of color when we sued, for example, the city when Claude Defay was discriminated in the Cadet Academy and unfairly terminated. So we are in the business of both holding police accountable and also making sure that police officers of color are being treated fairly. So my comments here today are not meant in any way to disparage the incredible leadership and work of officers, particularly officers of color who are much needed on the ground. You have, as a body, the power to do this. It is in your inherent powers that are constitutionally reserved for cities and states. And we are already in a landscape where the co-op, which has already been referenced in multiple occasions, the Community Ombudsman Oversight Panel exists. But I want to be very clear. The process is confusing. It has no teeth. And at Lawyers for Civil Rights, we have been repeatedly fielding phone calls and requests for more transparency, engagement, and accessibility with co-op. I can show you many emails going back years where community leaders like Jamal Crawford have been clamoring for an expansion of the resources and authority that the co-op has. This proposal would be to essentially completely overhaul co-op, which could very well be needed. Right now in the co-op, there are no appointments from any single one of you. It is critical that the appointments come beyond the mayor's office for you as representatives of the people to have appointment power for this type of police oversight. It is also critical to incorporate components of what Johaida Alvarez articulated so clearly: subpoena power, the power to compile data and evidence, the power to be able to receive complaints through a multitude of channels. Just this morning, in anticipation of this hearing, I went to the co-op's website, and in the link that says, click here to file a complaint, the link is broken. I mean, isn't that so symbolic for the conversation we are having today? That even the link that is supposed to be accessible from City Hall's website for co-op does not function. And it is very clear that you cannot do any type of complaint filing by phone or in Spanish, or let alone social media in the ways that were just articulated by New York City. This is what I am referring to as a complete deficit in the functions of the co-op. No disrespect to the incredible people already affiliated with the co-op who are doing their very best with very limited resources. I also want to point out that in anticipation of this hearing, I emailed the co-op board. The response is a generic email. It doesn't have any information about timeline or next steps in terms of guidance or support for individuals. So you're essentially sending an email into a vacuum. This is not the way our city should be working. Madam Chair, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor Mejia, and other distinguished members of this body, I urge you to move in this direction. This is not the time to continue studying these reforms. We must implement immediate action. And if City Hall is not here to to be able to articulate its reasons for not doing so, then it is deeply, deeply needed that each of you exercise leadership in championing these important reforms. We cannot wait for another Terrence Coleman in Boston. We cannot wait for police officers to police themselves and for the powers that be to protect them. It is critical that we can create structures to be able to applaud police and exonerate them if they've been wrongly accused, and be able to hold them accountable when there is a there. And by this, I mean, even in the example of Terrence Coleman, which was the result of policing not sensitive to mental health or disabilities, we still have no change, zero change in the way law enforcement in Boston interacts with civilians experiencing mental health distress or disabilities. No change. And that is because co-op has no teeth. It is critical that we push this forward to make sure that people like Terrence Coleman and Hope Coleman can have justice. And thank you, Madam Chair, for squeezing me in.
Thank you very much. Representative Holmes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you to all of the city councilors for giving me a moment. I too want to just thank you guys for doing yeoman's work on this, as it is a challenge in these times to, of course, hear the many perspectives. And I especially want to thank just the city councilors who has been having the conversations with police and unions in advance of this to make sure that as we consider what the next step is, we don't do it as in a vacuum and just hearing just from our constituency or hearing from our perspectives politically, but making sure they were involved. And I know some of the city councilors with obviously Councilor Campbell leading a conversation last week, was really on the phone last week, really hearing real criticism about some of the things that police were going to be concerned about. And that's very important, that obviously we know nothing is perfect out the gate, but then to be able to modify it along the way. My few moments of your time is just to reinforce, as Ivan was saying, the importance of the co-op not having teeth and us needing to move forward with a civilian review board that has teeth. And I really want to thank the folks from New York. I'm sorry for interrupting before your Q&A, but seeing what you've done and the things that you've even put in place, as mentioned just before, you are light years ahead of us. And certainly the thing that sticks out to me, that if this can be done in such a large police staff in New York and it's able to be done there, then certainly we can get it done here in Boston with so much of a smaller system here. And as you said, with the 5 boroughs, each one of those boroughs are much larger than just Boston by itself. And so when you think about what's possible here, we in Boston, of course, have a competitive thought with New York on many things, and we don't like to see you ahead of us in front of on anything. So I'm hoping that's going to invoke all of the city councilors to say, we got to beat you guys in something else. And not only do we take the things that are your best practices in New York, but also improve upon those and take some of your lessons learned. I also just wanted to reiterate that we are back from vacation at the State House, and 3 months ago or so, the elected of color here in Boston and across the Commonwealth stood in front of the State House to say there were some things that we thought was most important to get done around police reform. I can tell you there are 4 items on the list that were state items. All 4, I'm yelling and screaming as loud as I can to get done in the next week or 2, because we've had that in conference committee and we thought we were gonna get it done in August. But certainly after the break, I'm certainly hoping we can get those things done. But we've got locked down on qualified immunity, but I'm hoping we can get past that even in the next week or so. The 2 items that were city level that all the folks around the city, around the cities around the Commonwealth thought were most important was, one of them was Civilian Review Board, and the other's already been done that Councilor Arroyo had begun around structural racism. And so I just ask that folks listen to the community, folks listen to us, and say that as that is Black, Latino, Asians have been saying, this is something that we've heard from our communities. And at the city level, Boston will set a precedent to make sure that a real civilian review board is in place that can be a model not only for the rest of the cities and towns across this Commonwealth, but across this country. And I ask you for your strong consideration. Thank you, Councilwoman, for just giving me a few minutes. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I think we had one more person in this first panel, two more people actually in the first panel, kind of combined the two. That's Brian Corr and Larry Mays. Brian, from the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Edwards, and thank you to the councilors who are the makers of this proposed ordinance, and thank you to the entire City Council for taking the time to have this hearing, and also I really appreciate being invited to speak. I will just say at the front end that I am located just across the river in Cambridge and do work on the national level on these issues, but also work here in Cambridge. So I am available as a resource to the City of Boston as you move forward on this work. So very briefly, I do think I should say a little bit about who I am. So as I said, I work for the City of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I came to the city in 2008 as the director of the city's Peace Commission, took on the civilian oversight work in 2010, and in that context, got involved in the National Association, NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And I've served on the national board for, I believe, 8 years, including 3 years as the elected president of the association. So I'm now in my waning time as immediate past president for about 1 more year on the board. So it's really in that capacity that I'm speaking with you today. And I want to just say a couple quick things and then talk a little bit about the nature of civilian oversight to give you a bit of an overview. Hopefully that will help put some of this into a broader context. But we have been in NACOL doing work around the country in the current moment. We always support our member agencies. We have over 100 civilian oversight entities, as well as individuals that do civilian oversight work, staff, appointed board members, people who are monitors on consent decrees from the Department of Justice, a whole range of people. But we all have the same goal. Ultimately, we all want to see peaceful and just communities. And I would argue that our police departments, of which there are about 18,000 around the country, at least in theory and largely in practice, have that as their goal. And part of the role of civilian oversight is to help make sure that departments are living up to that, that depending on the laws, the history, the governmental structure, and the community needs, that some form of oversight can be put in place to help ensure that the law enforcement agency, the police department, is responsive to the needs of the community, is accountable when individual cases of misconduct or patterns of misconduct happen, and also that you have people from the community who are citizens, civilians, residents, every term's a little problematic, but who really have direct input into not just cases, but also the policies and procedures that a police department is using. And that's one of the really important principles for civilian oversight. And it's one of the things that I've seen in this draft ordinance, and know that people around the country are really looking at not just back-end accountability. When something goes wrong, how do we hold people accountable, which is necessary, but also front-end accountability. How do we ensure that the systems we have in place, the training, the policies, and the procedures really create the kind of policing that our communities want and deserve? And that has to be tailored to each community. Just go back a little bit, just to give you a little framework around oversight. I think Councilor Bach mentioned that civilian oversight goes back to the 1920s, and the first efforts really go back to Los Angeles, when the Bar Association there tried to create some form of civilian oversight. It was obviously outside of the government, had limited ability to make a difference, and we've seen many changes through the years. John Darsh from CCRB mentioned the changes in their agency over the decades. So it's existed for many decades, but in its current form, not so long. And really, the current wave of the type of civilian oversight that people are pushing for and that we've seen really be effective goes back to the 1980s. Cambridge's board goes back to '84. There are 3 basic models of oversight. Your City Council here has been looking at a very specific model. I won't go through them all, but investigative, review, and auditor and monitor, or inspector general, are the 3 basic models. what Boston is looking at creating with this ordinance is clearly a hybrid, which we're seeing more and more often. One of the things that NACOL can really bring to this conversation is we got a grant from the Department of Justice during the Obama administration and did 9 case studies of communities around the country, different sizes, different oversight models, but major cities that had civilian oversight. And based on that, we're on the verge of issuing a report. I was able to share with Councilor Campbell and her staff some of the information from that. We have 13 principles for effective oversight, which I won't go through in detail because we just don't have a lot of time, and some recommendations about how to actually put those into practice. I think when I look through the ordinance that's been drafted, most of those things are present. They include things like independence, unfettered access to records and resources, community outreach, community representation on the board, proper training, which is vital for staff and board members to do this work. I can't emphasize how important proper training is. And these elements are very important in any type of oversight. One thing that you'll hear from those of us who do this work is that every city is different, every model is different. And so while we learn from other communities, we have to create something that works in the specific context of our city. There is no best form of oversight, but there is a best fit for any given city. And when we look at the history of Boston, the oldest police department in the country, which has this very interesting combined history of the legacy of the English constables and the history of Sir Robert Peel talking about the police are the public and the public are the police, as well as the increasingly well-known history of slave patrols in the South, slave catchers in the North. We have an interesting hybrid. And in Boston, we do have an opportunity to create something that, again, it won't be the best or the strongest form of oversight because I don't personally believe there is such a thing, but a model of oversight that will represent something unique in this country, that the city of Boston with its unique story and often painful history, with the history of trauma in the community, with the things that the Boston Police Department has undergone, including the Boston Marathon bombing, the nature of trauma as it affects all aspects of the community. Boston has a really unique opportunity to create a form of oversight that works, that is sustainable, that meets the effective practices that have been set out by NACOL through our research, and that really lives up to what we've seen in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. If people have not had a chance to read it, I really urge people to review the report of that task force. There's also executive summary and an implementation guide, so depending on how deeply you want to dig into it. But the principles in that report are vitally important as we look at transforming policing. Some of those principles are things that have been studied for over 120 years, going back to the Wickersham Commission at the turn of the last century, and yet we still as a nation need to implement them. There's a ton I could say, there's lots more I want to say. Hopefully I'll be able to answer some questions to address that, but I'm just watching the time. I know I've spoken for a little over 5 minutes, so with respect to the work that you all have to do, I want to try to keep my comments brief. But again, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very excited to partner with my colleagues in Boston as we continue to build the movement for not just civilian oversight, but really for policing that truly creates, again, peaceful and just communities as we all deserve. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Larry Mays. Is Larry?
Someone let him know we can't hear him. Thanks.
Thanks, Council. I do this a million times. First of all, I want to thank Brian Corr for his testimony. Brian is one of the best in the country. And in particular, I want to thank the work of Councilor Edwards and in particular Councilor Campbell for trying to putting this together and putting this ordinance together. I don't have prepared marks, but what I like to do is just talk about some of the points I saw with the ordinance, as well as some of the comments that were made from New York, and of course Brian's comments and some of the comments made by the counselors, all of which, most of which that I agree with. So in the context, for me, when it comes to civilian review boards or the work that I did with the co-op, I've been off the co-op now almost a year. The key to me was the ability to make sure that it was all in the context of community policing. Boston has been the darling, if you will, of community policing in the United States. And because of our continued work in looking at the issue of police accountability, violence in the community in the context, if you will, of public health. And so I think to the regard that we continue to do that, I think we're in good stead. I also absolutely want to give a shout out to many of you, many of the counselors who are part of neighborhood groups with the police. So I think those are vital actions that happen on the ground that mediate, if you will, issues around trust between citizens as well as police. One of the things I saw in the ordinance that I really, really liked was trying to go after the issue of when a citizen makes a complaint to resolution. I think that is a critical process piece that cannot be ignored. In my experience on the co-op, many times you had complaints when you went through the file. By the time we were able to give an answer, there was almost, in certain cases, in more cases than not, almost 2 years had gone by before the citizen actually got a resolution, which by that time, in more cases than not, memories fade on both the police side as well as the citizen making the complaint, as well as, files get old and that sort of thing. So to the degree that we compress and you staff and you think through the compression time from the point of complaint to when a citizen gets an answer, I think is really, really critical. The other thing is I absolutely agree that that the police department is not the only place you go to make a complaint, right? If I feel that I have been wronged by a police officer, frankly, I don't want to go to the police department to make a complaint. I want to go to the place where I feel safe, that I will be heard. So on its face, I think anything that we can do in terms of online technology or creating other places like community centers or at a place at City Hall, apart from just the police department, is the right thing to do. The other thing I would say is I would spend a lot of time, and I think I saw some of this here in the ordinances, is really looking at that budget in terms of the department and who's spending what. Investigations are going to be expensive, and I think as you get a chance to drill down with our colleagues from New York to really get into that piece of the spending on the investigative side that will happen when you have investigative powers by a civilian review board. I don't disagree with it. I think it's not a bad thing, but I think it has to be watched so that just as the police and their budgets need to be accountable, a department in a city that is tied to a civilian review board has to watch closely its spending. Now, in terms of effectiveness, I think, and we recommended this, the co-op back in 2015, you absolutely, if you have a civilian review board, you absolutely should have a department with a budget that's well-staffed with analysts, a mediation specialist, an executive director, people who are trained to understand government, the law, process, and regulations, and that sort of thing. I think is critical because that will, I think, cut down on what could be very expensive costs in regards to investigations. Not that it should not be done. I just believe that you cannot walk away from or take lightly, and I don't think you have, the cost of investigations. The other thing is I'm really excited about, and I saw this here in the ordinance, the use of the 311 system. That's one of the things that I had pushed for in the recommendation back in 2015. And basically the thought was this: if I'm driving down, let's say Boston Street in Boston, I hit a pothole, my tire is blown out, I can pull out my smartphone, I can, you know, say what happened, and then I'll get a ticket back. So there's a file that can be tracked. Similar, I think, things can happen between a police officer and a citizen. The interaction may not be negative, it may be positive. So whether it's positive or negative, the citizen, in terms of agency, having power, right on scene, should be able to send a praise or a complaint on the 311 system. Now the point is, and on the back end, is who gets that information. I think it should go to the police department. It could be the BRIC or whatever thing that they think is appropriate, as well as to the Civilian Review Board, or in particular, the department that is being created with the IT specialists as a part of it. And you have to have people on staff who have, you have to have interpreters, language interpreters on staff. Many times in terms of complaints, be it positive, you know, a complaint of service to the police department. If you don't know what the language of the person is making a complaint, that puts that person's life in danger. It may also put a police officer's life in danger. So I think you need to have language specialists as part of the staffing. Also, what I think I also want to comment on, the Harvard mediation component for mediation between Boston police officers and citizens, I think was an exceptional idea. And the fact that very few cases went to that mediation department, I thought was a mistake. In fact, the idea came from the Boston police, from Frankie, Superintendent Mancini, who saw that if you could have the sterling and the amazing operation of the Harvard mediation negotiation school and law school as a part of it, you could have a very fair and open conversation between a citizen and an officer. That's a good thing, because most of the cases that I saw had to do with a citizen feeling that they have been disrespected, have been talked to, have been cursed at, have been ignored, or whatever. And that stuff drove them crazy when they felt that they were disrespected by an officer, and there was no means by which to have that encounter dealt with. So, you know, mediation, I think, is a big deal. I think you double down on that, and you make this a part of what you're trying to do with this Civilian Review Board. That's all my comments. As you know, as many of you know, I was the Chief of Human Services for the City of Boston, and when I was doing that work, we very much partnered with the police department. The Boston Police Department had and still have very, very smart, very dedicated officers, and there were some great initiatives that we were able to work on in order to bring down incidents of crime, but also making sure as a principle that police officers were not apart from the community, but that they were very much part of the community. So in all of this, I will please keep that in mind, to do all that you can. And I've seen some ways where you've tried to do this in the ordinance, to keep police officers and citizens together in this idea to bring about community policing and community justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To my colleagues, we still have about 2 panels. And so what my plan is to move this along is to give a half hour for all of us to ask the people who just spoke any questions or to have some comments. That equals to about 2.5 to 3 minutes each person, each of the colleagues that are still here. Then we will move to our second panels and we will have them both do their presentations all at once. That includes ACLU Matthew Allen, Violence in Boston, Monica Cannon, a youth person, leader in our community, Darwin Saravia. That also includes Mamelo, Representative Eddie Crispin, and Diego, representative. These are law enforcement officers, minority law enforcement officer organizations, David Hernandez. They will come after. So I'm going to be very strict with time with my colleagues to have those questions asked to the people who just spoke. Again, if we go into police contracts and other topics that we're going to cover this afternoon, I will push my colleagues to wait for that questioning later. This is for even the co-sponsors. This is to allow us to really have that conversation and to respect the time of the folks who haven't spoken yet. So with that, I'm getting my timer ready and we will go to the lead sponsor, Andrea Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and I'll be brief. I have engaged with the panelists and those who couldn't attend today's hearing many times, and including with respect to this specific language. So thank you all for taking the time to be here. It is absolutely value added. I was taking a lot of notes, and I will stay in touch with each and every one of you. Especially helpful to the conversation and the framing were the folks from New York, so thank you. I will give my time to my colleagues who have not had the opportunity to engage with the panelists in this on this panel. Thank you. And thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you. Have we been joined by Councilor Arroyo?
No, not yet. So not sure what's going on, but I'll keep you posted. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia, 3 minutes.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. I just have a few questions. I would like to just, with Johaida Alvarez, if you're still with us, you mentioned that the police commissioner is the one with the ultimate issue, who will ultimately issue the disciplinary actions. Have there ever been any instances where the board recommended discipline and the commissioner refuses? And what has that process looked like?
Thank you, Counselor. John had to hop off due to childcare issues. So in those situations that we called it concurrence, when the board recommends discipline and the police commissioner agrees with that discipline, that is an element of why the policy is the policy department is so important to track those levels of concurrence. So there are situations where the police commissioner reduces the recommendation and there are also situations where the police commissioner increases the level of disciplinary recommendation. So we track all of that on our data transparency initiative. One thing to note that with the administrative prosecution unit, those are a little bit, different because it's a guilty, not guilty verdict. In the guilty verdicts, when we recommend a specific, amount of vacation days, et cetera, or suspension, that's tracked and also explained on why the police commissioner deviated from it. But due to the recent charter changes in November, now what the police commissioner has to do with cases that aren't as severe as the APU cases, so anything below charges and specifications, when they deviate from a substantiated allegation of misconduct, they have to write us a deviation letter, which explains in detail what circumstances inform their decision to reduce that recommended discipline. And we can send you that charter language as well.
Yes, thank you. That would be extremely helpful. This question is going to go to Brian. So I'm just curious, something that we've been thinking about is that there's one thing to create a civilian review board, but it's another for people to actually use it. It's in its entirety. And I'm thinking particularly about our non-English speaking communities, particularly those who are undocumented. How can we make sure that not only that it's the policy making stages, but in the actual rollout that this ordinance is looking at building pathways to engagement for undocumented people? What are some of your thoughts and reactions around that?
Through you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Councilor Mejia. That's a great question, and to be honest, the answer is actually quite complicated. There are a lot of different ways that we've seen people around the country do this. So there are certainly places like Denver, Los Angeles, Seattle that have done, and I could certainly refer people to other places as this process goes forward. They have done a very good job creating mechanisms for sustained community outreach that include outreach to people who are not speakers of English as their first language, and also, to the extent possible, helping communities who may have people in their families or in their communities who are not in status, but still have complaints against the police to feel confident and secure. In some places, that's done by having anonymous complaints. That's not possible everywhere. It varies a lot according to state law and collective bargaining agreements. The other piece I would say around that is really making sure that the oversight agency is partnering with organizations and community groups that are in the community. In Cambridge, again, we're smaller than Boston. It's not the greatest comparison. New York is probably a better comparison in certain ways, but we've worked with our board members to go out and meet with community groups to do presentations, partnered with public housing, partnered with some of the community centers that are working with some of our more vulnerable populations, especially Muslim populations and refugees from East Africa in the north part of Cambridge. And there's really no one size fits all. I think the key ultimately is creating a track record that shows that when people make complaints, they're taken seriously, that people are treated justly, that they feel like they're treated with respect when they go in, that they're not made fun of or belittled or told, well, why did you do that? How come you didn't do this? It's really about creating an environment where people start to spread the word through their organic networks that, you know what, this is something that is good, it's helpful. I had a chance to tell my story, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Thank you for that. And I get really paranoid about my time. So I have one more question, Councilor Edwards, give me a minute. Hopefully, I'm just curious, and this might be a philosophical question. And I'm just, oftentimes when a school isn't performing to the rate that it should, or something happens, normally what happens is that school gets shut down, or they get put in any kind of performing level or something. There is some very specific ramifications that happens as a result. It seems like when it comes to the police department, it's a little bit harder for us to kind of hold that accountability. And I'm just wondering, why is that? Why is it's okay for us to be able to shut down schools that are not performing well, but for us to continue to tolerate behavior that oftentimes is not reflective of the whole idea of protecting and serving? So what's that all about? And anyone can answer that question if they choose to.
And that would be the final question.
Yeah. I like to get an understanding of why it's okay. I mean, if I need to understand what's the difference between shutting down a school that's not performing and holding a police officer accountable for misconduct. What is the difference between those two? And why are we having this conversation?
Well, this is Brian Core. I'll be trying to be very brief. I would say the main difference is the history in our society, the nature of policing, and the ways in which policing has been forced to take on roles that are really they're first responders. It's not only they're enforcing the law, but they're the people that show up at 3 in the morning when something terrible is happening. And as we as a society really grapple with this, I think we're for the first time in my life, in over 50 years, having real conversations about what is real public safety. What does that look like? And part of that is ensuring that the people that it's their job to carry out public safety are held accountable, and there are actually people who are able to do that. So again, I won't get into a million issues around history and politics and unions and contracts and all that, but I would say it's not okay. And we're finally at a point in our society where collectively we're saying, what are the changes that we can make in how we govern our society so that that doesn't happen? So to the extent possible, people get proper policing, and people who aren't policing properly are not police.
Thank you very much. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll stay with Brian. Brian, I had just a question in terms of the Boston program, the Ombudsman panel. How do you think it can be enhanced to carry out some of the questions and concerns that have been raised in the first round?
All right, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, to Councilor Flaherty. The short version is, since there are other people here, that they actually put out report about 5 years ago. They did research, they talked to NACOL, the co-op. They met with our oversight board in Cambridge to look at our model and came up with some very specific recommendations, many of which are reflected in the ordinance, but ultimately were about creating a standalone civilian oversight office that could receive complaints, that could do investigations. And I think those recommendations for the co-op really speak for themselves. Those are the kinds of things that really increase legitimacy, the feeling people have that this is an agency that actually can take care of me. It gives people, as others have said, a place to go that's not in the police department. And it allows people to believe that investigations are being carried out fairly. Whether or not it's true, many people don't have trust that the police will investigate themselves without some outside oversight or agency. And so to create this separate agency that's within city government to do investigations, that has proper training and can make recommendations and impose discipline, I think will go a huge way to taking the vision of the co-op and the desire that the people that have worked on it wanted and turning that into true civilian oversight of the Boston Police Department in a way that supports the community broadly and the officers.
So more maybe on, it's more on about branding in terms of just the way, the name that it's called, and then some enhanced powers?
I guess just to follow up, I would say that I think it really does need to have be a standalone agency with staffing and the ability to receive complaints separate from the police department. I think that's some of the most important things. And then to be able to actually do those investigations outside the police department. If you look at major cities around the country, Boston is well within the zone of cities that have independent investigations separate from the internal affairs or professional standards unit. So I would say that those aspects are really important, that it's a separate standalone agency that can take complaints and make recommendations and have the ability to either have those stick or have the police commissioner respond in writing why the commissioner's decision is different.
Thank you, Brian. And to Ms. Alvarez, how many complaints are there every year in New York? I counted all the boxes. It looked like there was maybe 35 to 37 person panel, which sometimes it might be like herding cats to kind of come to a consensus and a conclusion as to whether something actually happened or not. So I think that's a significant number of people, but there's also a big funding piece associated with that as well. So how many complaints in a year? And then how long does it take the New York panel from start to finish to complete their investigation and make a decision?
Thank you. So that's a great question. So I know it's our board is composed of 15 members, but each case is reviewed by a 3-member panel. So it's once it gets majority, if it's a split, then it goes to our full board. So in 2019, we received about 4,900 complaints, so about 5,000. And in terms of the length of time that it takes, that time has increased because of body-worn camera footage and also just the abundance of video footage. Like, for example, a few years ago, back in about 2016, the average time would be about 3 months. And now that time has increased by several months. And that's due to the body-worn camera, the rollout of the body-worn camera program in NYPD, but also that civilians are recording incidents that occur. Like, for example, in the recent protests that we saw here in New York City, we had 750 complaints that were filed in a short amount of time based off of around 250 individual instances. So that means that we were having repeat complaints about a single incident. So reviewing all of that footage to make sure that we are making those recommendations based off of the merits really extends the amount of time. So that's something to consider. And also receiving that body-worn camera footage from the police department.
Overall, the number of complaints in a year, ballpark?
5,000.
5,000. And have you seen those numbers go up or down in recent years?
I will.
Council Flaherty, just the time check.
Yep.
Yeah, I will send you, Counselor, a link to our data transparency initiative. It's hovered around 4,500 for the past few years. But we did see an increase in 2019, and that may be due to our outreach efforts, but we can't really say for sure why that number increased.
And hours here in Boston have consistently gone down over the years, and particularly once the body cameras have been implemented, we've seen a significant decrease in complaints as well. So, but thank you for your time and attention, and thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me an extra question.
Thank you. Councillor Braden.
Thank you. I had a quick question about the process with the co-op as it stands right now. Is the lack of a subpoena power really restricting in their ability to get evidence in a case?
Well, I haven't been on the co-op since the end of November, so I don't know what's happening now. But you know, you had two different kinds of cases that will come to an ombudsman. One were the random pulls, you know, random cases, more cases that you would see were quality assurance cases, right? And I love those cases because you get to see whether or not a case was handled fairly or not by the police department. And, you know, they didn't know it was going to be pulled. And then you had your cases on appeal in which someone has actually filed a complaint and that sort of thing. So in terms of materials, receiving investigatory materials, that stuff was given to you up front. Once that file, whether appealed file or a random file, was given to an ombudsman.
Very good.
Brian, actually, Brian Corr had raised his hand, Councillor Braden.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just very briefly, just nationally, what I would say is that we at NACOL do recommend subpoena power. My agency in Cambridge has it. Now, the reality is in Cambridge, we haven't had to use it for many, many years, at least 15 years. But it often is an important part of helping set the tone that people should be expected to cooperate with the agency. So it's generally seen as an effective practice. It's usually not something that will make or break an agency. And it is often something that community activists are very much looking for, that it can be the thing that makes people feel that this agency is serious or not, if it has the power to compel witnesses and testimony. And I'll just add that it generally does not mean that you can bring officers in, but you can bring in other witnesses, get materials, video, that sort of thing.
Very good, thank you. In the interest of time, Madam Chair, I think I will let you move ahead. I know we have another panel still to hear.
Thank you very much, Councillor Braden. Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll also try to be brief, and I have a question that actually does connect to our afternoon hearing, but I think it's appropriate to ask here, which is just to the extent that the folks from New York can speak to when you were setting all of this up. I mean, was the issue mainly changes in city charter and or state law, or to what extent did you need to negotiate changes in your police union contracts in order to give this system its purchase?
Great question. And even not only when the agency was in its infancy stages, but even now we see that some changes are tied to not only local law, but state law and collective bargaining agreements. So I can't speak to the origins of how tangled that web is weaved, but those are considerations that we do consider moving forward. So that's where really strong relationships with our law department, our elected officials, the general counsel on staff, researching what would be implicated if we were to either implement a new change, propose a new change, or be affected by legislation. I hope that answers your question, but that's as far as we can go with it.
I'm curious how much do you find that your police commissioner is able to be effective in like when he or she takes disciplinary action? Is it generally upheld?
Yeah, so that's where the concurrence issue is very important, and holding all parties accountable, where we can track the times that the commissioner has again agreed with those disciplinary recommendations, the times that they've deviated, how they compare to previous commissioners, and the reasons that they provide when deviating from that recommendation. But you know, generally they do. Some level of discipline is imposed on those officers when the board recommends discipline.
Sorry, I was asking that's really helpful. I was asking a slightly different question based on our situation in Boston, which is just that frequently the disciplinary actions of our police commissioners over a series of commissioners have been overturned on appeal because of the way our contracts are structured. And so the funny thing is that even if you got a police commissioner to constantly follow the recommendations of a civilian review board, the civilian review board could then be frustrated in the same way that the police commissioners have been frustrated. And so I was kind of curious whether you guys have a similar dynamic, or if you find that when such that you're recommending something, the police commissioner is concurring, and then a year, 2 years later, that gets reversed by an arbitrator, or if you find that when you guys concur and take action, it's generally effectual.
It's generally effectual.
Great. Okay, that's wonderful to understand. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. In the interest of time, I'll defer further questions.
Thank you very much. Councillor Flynn.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. No questions, Councillor Edwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did step away for a brief moment to take a prearranged commitment. Anyway, so I hope I'm not asking a question that's already been asked, but I am curious about the report that recommends community involvement as in the oversight efforts, and I wonder how the community is actually involved in some of those decisions and creating those policies. And if it's been already asked and answered, I'm happy to review the footage later. Anybody?
Councilor, were you referring
more for
to
Brian,
co-op?
or maybe Larry?
Councilor, were you referring to the co-op?
So just whether it's the co-op or just in general, the oversight boards. I think this question's maybe more for Brian.
Right.
Just curious about the community's involvement in policy creation, both to inform the work of the oversight board, but then also to inform some of the policies that are created out of that effort.
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you, Councilor Asabi George. I would say that there are a couple different ways. There's sort of the broad outreach efforts, and that's, again, done different ways in different cities. I know in New York City, they have a whole outreach team, and again, Javier could speak to that better than I could, but one of the things they do is they actually meet in different boroughs. They have a regular schedule so that even their board meetings are felt to be more accessible by getting around the city and helping people to be able to attend. The other piece I would say is that when many boards are looking at policies, there's a couple different parts. There can be reviewing existing policies. That tends to be done more by staff and board members and policy analysts, depending on the size of the oversight agency in the community. When people are looking at new policies, I'd say that's where I've seen some really interesting models of how people have done that. It can take the form of forming a task force to look at specific issues, which may be very similar to what's happening in Boston in the mayoral administration right now. It's happening in cities around the country. There also can be a process where the board members actually are working with policy writers in the police department to sit down, review other policies from other communities, and then do work in the community to get feedback. I think it's around use of force in particular, anything that involves, for what used to be called like impact policing and the various ways in which policing is more aggressive and proactive. Those are the kinds of policies that really should be informed by a very direct involvement of the community, by having conversations, and not just the town hall meetings where people come and stand at the mic and speak, because we all know who comes to do that, but really finding ways to reach out to people and get opinions from people. In Cambridge, we have a community outreach team that is made of people from different immigrant and racial and ethnic communities that have those connections directly. So anyway, again, at the risk of talking too long, I'd be happy to speak more to people offline, but there are a lot of ways that can happen, I'd say needs to happen, especially around policies that are more high profile, that really are where we're seeing the disconnect between the needs and standards of the community and the kind of policing people feel they're receiving.
Thank you, Brian, for that. That was very helpful. And I think you took my question, clarified in your own mind, and gave me a good response. I appreciate that informed response. The around some of these,
we were keeping kind of to the 3 minutes for each folks. So if this is your last one, okay.
No, I wanted to ask, it's more of a direct question around the statute of limitations around filing complaints. What's sort of the general, what do you have in New York and what's happening in Cambridge around that statute of limitations?
Our statute of limitations is 18 months with the crime exception. So if there's exception of crime that is being alleged, then that's suspended. But then also with COVID-19, there was a toll on our statute of limitations due to those extraordinary circumstances.
And in Cambridge, it's 60 days according to our rules, and that can be waived by the board for cause. And I would say that the tendency has been for the board to waive it unless there's really sort of no good reason. I mean, because it could just be the person didn't know that the board existed. And the main thing we see around the country is most places have limits, and it's really around investigations. The main reason to have a time limit is so that you're not digging things up from 5 years ago, and then it's hard to get people's memories and hard to find evidence and witnesses. So it's really about making sure that the investigations are respectful to everyone involved, the complainant, the witnesses, and the officers.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Janey?
Hello. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. First, just want to thank the panel. I would ask that if we could have any written presentations sent or resent to the council, that would be helpful. And this is really for Cambridge and New York. Anyone can answer. I'd be interested in a breakdown of cases, understanding whether or not there is a wide range of the types of cases that come before you. Are they pretty much cases involving some sort of assault with a civilian or verbal abuse with a civilian? Then I would also be interested in a breakdown by race of the civilians who are making these cases, as well as a breakdown of the officers involved. And then what are the outcomes? What percentage of these civilian concerns are kind of upheld by these decisions of the board versus not? And whether or not there's an opportunity to appeal. And then I am also interested around the contract issue that Councilor Sabi George just mentioned. You know, there could be some decision, or I don't know if it was Councilor Bach.
Councilor Bach.
That mentions, you know, there could be something that happens that then will come back to a contract issue and then we'll find the officer back. So I'm interested how that works in Cambridge and in New York. And then finally, if we could speak to engagement, different ways of engagement, and whether or not there's a sense of changed culture in the community in terms of the trust building, community policing, et cetera. So it's around the breakdown of cases, breakdown by race, opportunities for appeal, contract issues, and engagement in changing the culture. Thank you so much.
Through you, Madam Chair, if I may start, only because my answer will be briefer, I promise. To you, Councilor Janey. First of all, in Cambridge, we have a relatively low number of complaints after a lot of work. I would say coming out of the wake of the arrest of Professor Gates over 10 years ago. So at this point, most of our complaints are really about conduct. We have only gotten a couple of use of force complaints in the last 4 years. I think we've gotten 2. Most are really around people feeling disrespected. The challenge with that is that in most of our complaints, and we don't have body-worn cameras in Cambridge. Most of our complaints, there are multiple accounts and we work with the preponderance of the evidence. So it can be challenging to demonstrate that someone was spoken to in a way that was rude or someone was racially profiled. So, you know, it's very approximately about 1/3 of our complaints are sustained, and they're often sustained because along the way, the officers didn't follow policies and procedures. And I know there were more questions, but I'm going to stop so that
racial breakdown of the civilians and the officers involved.
Yeah, so in Cambridge, we don't have a we don't have a policy of asking people to state their race when they make complaints. It's something that I have thought about quite a bit. So we don't have a racial breakdown on the complainants, and the officers, because we don't track it by complaints, we don't track so I won't go on and on. So we don't have that data for Cambridge, although I would say it is generally an effective practice to do so.
Thank you. And if we could hear from New York, Madam Chair. Thank you for being brief, Brian.
Yes, this is a wonderful question and a lot of data. So we do track race. It's an optional question. So we have a robust database of not only the demographic breakdown of the complainants and alleged victims, but also the demographic breakdown of the police officers by race and gender. So on our website, which I will send, it has a breakdown of also the incidents of the complaint, what time of day that these incidents occurred. Predominantly, our complaint victims are men, and usually men of color. In our recent youth report, because we track this information, it was predominantly young boys of color, in particular Black boys. Ages 10 to 18 that had filed complaints against misconduct. Those complaints were initiated by a parent and guardian in the majority of those instances. And again, that's why the policy element is so important to understand trends in these instances. In the recent youth report, the types of allegations were for youth engaging in seemingly innocuous activity like high-fiving, jaywalking, wrestling, playing, etc. So I'll be happy to send the breakdown of that. In terms of dispositions, what we found is about 20% are substantiated. Again, but most of the complaint dispositions are based off of the merits, which means that because we have the video evidence, we do find that the police officer maybe committed the act, but it wasn't misconduct. So again, it's really important to get that all the data points in these investigations. The last question about community involvement. Sorry, can you repeat that part?
Did you have, before we move on to that, did you have a breakdown of the officers involved by race? So you mentioned it was mostly the civilians, were mostly boys of color.
Yeah, it's with that, I'll have to get back to you on the breakdown of that. It's also proportional to the demographic composition of the NYPD as well.
Yeah, the final questions, and it was on the contract, whether your contract was kind of impeding things in terms of your board, but also engagement, just in terms of changing the culture. So NYPD, clearly there's a reputation there, a national reputation. Have you guys seen locally some culture change? That's it for me, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe we discussed the contract already with Councilor Bach with NYPD. So if you want to briefly touch on increase in trust or transparency, I think that would be great. And then we need to get to the other councilors.
So briefly, although we oversee the NYPD, it's really important to have a working relationship with the department, which I feel that we have in engaging in conversations around policing, in sharing information on a macro level, but also on a micro level, meeting regularly with the department, with changes in the patrol guide, et cetera. What I can speak on in terms of relations and oversight with the public, it's really important for us to take responsibility for building that trust. So if a civilian feels that they don't hear from us in a prompt manner, that's something that we take very seriously. If there are civilians that didn't even know that we exist, we want to meet them where they are. So one example is that we started CCRB courtside, where we go to basketball courts, football fields with a validator in that community, directly just sharing information that we exist if they've experienced misconduct. So there are multiple ways, and we can talk offline about how to really build those community relations.
Thank you. We're going to go on to Councilor Wu, then Councilor Baker. See if Councilor Wu is still with us. She may have stepped off. Okay. Councilor, then Councilor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a couple questions around what what complaints would be mediated, but I think Larry answered those questions. And Larry also brought up another point, and not necessarily for this panel or for even this hearing, would be what the cost of setting up basically a whole new city department would be. Would that department fall under the police department? You know, so maybe as we're moving forward, we're thinking about finances, we're thinking about what this may cost. Brian Core, you've been very informative. Thank you very much. And Ms. Alvarez, thank you for coming today. And so the concurrence rate, what would you say the percentage of the concurrence rate? When does the police commissioner and the board, when do they agree? Like what percentage you think? Is it a high percentage or low percentage?
So I'll get you the specific numbers, but for the administrative prosecution unit, where there's some discipline imposed, it's about 73%. But the actual concurrence rate, I believe, is around 30. And I'll get back to you on the exact.
So pretty low. It's pretty low.
And those were the last recorded figures for it.
Okay. Thank you. And just to answer to Mr. Mandrell there from the Lawyers for Civil Rights, he said the police have no way in dealing with people with mental health, but I think we spoke to that this year with the best clinicians. So hopefully that's something that will start to get better in the city of Boston. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all, just more comments. And I would like to somehow, as we go through this process, and if it's when and if it comes to a vote, that we're taking into account the finances around this. What is this going to cost when the vote is happening? Again, that's not necessarily for today, but if we could keep an eye on that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Just to briefly add some comments, what I've heard so far in terms of making sure that we have an effective civilian review board or any review board, I'm looking at subpoena powers, independent in its structure from the police, independent in its accessibility from the police, so people can sign in and directly go to this institution, that they have the ability to discipline or at least make very strong disciplinary recommendations, that there is language access, that there is an appointment power shared by the mayor and by the city council, and that there's, whether there is in the end discipline or not, that there's constant and consistent data collection, so that we are very clear of what's coming in, what's going out, and what's going on, no matter what. That there is, just to be clear with folks how this process works, the city council or the mayor may propose a new department, but they need each other in order to create it. So this needs to be passed with the mayor, or if the mayor was to propose something, he would need to be passing it with us. So this is going to be a joint back and forth effort, so people understand our charter and how this works. And then finally, we wanted to make the question I think that Frank has, Councilor Baker, excuse me, is how much would it cost? I do believe, one of the worst things that we could do is set something up and not provide a sufficient budget for it. And then we look at it and all are proud of the piece of paper that it's on and it doesn't do anything. So I just want to be clear, that's what I'm seeing as the request, recommendations, suggestions, thoughts. And I think that those are things that we would take to us to a working session, looking at the current proposed language, talking with the administration, and talking also with, I believe there's several co-op members listening right now to this hearing as well. And the question is, what do we change co-op into something else, or do we create a whole new entity? So that's where I am in terms of headspace and what I expect our council's conversation to continue. With that,
Madam Chair, one more thing, and also to add on to that, would this, it would be separate from the police, but would it come out of the police budget?
That's a question we would have to make.
So would you add that to your list? Thank you.
So how much is it going to cost and where the money's going to come from? Okay, very well. With that, I'm going to go now to our second panel. It's going to be combined of the second two panels. We will hear from Matthew Allen from the ACLU. I think Monica could not make it, so I have also Darwin Saravia, our youth leader and advocate. We also have from Mamalo Eddie Crispin, Police Officer Eddie Crispin, and from Diego, Police Officer Dave Hernandez. So that's 4 people I have. If I'm missing anyone, please raise your blue hands if you were already scheduled for a panelist and either you're late or I didn't say your name. And we're going to start with each one and give them about 3 to 5 minutes to speak, and then we will do the same kind of questions coming afterwards. So with that, is Mr. or Attorney Matthew Allen available?
Yes, hi there.
Hi, thank you.
My pleasure, it's good to be here. My name is Matt Allen. I'm Field Director of the ACLU of Massachusetts, and I'd like to thank Councilor Campbell for the invitation to speak here, and Councilors Campbell, Mia, and Arroyo for inviting the ACLU, for making this ordinance, and the council as a whole, really, for your efforts to increase police accountability in Boston. I want to start by mentioning that the ACLU has taken the position of divesting from police and investing in community services to address the underlying needs that we currently respond to with police, such as poverty, mental health issues, and substance use disorder and trauma. This proposal could require increasing funding for the department. It will. And that may be seen as antithetical to that goal of divesting. But it is clear if the city is going to move forward with a civilian review board, it's important that it's done right, so it's more than just a symbolic body. And to that end, the ACLU has identified several factors which are essential in the creation and operation of an effective civilian review board. Some of those include a board majority nominated by civic organizations, independent investigatory authority, ensuring that discipline sticks, audit policies and practices, and public access in reporting. And in the interest of time, I just want to focus on a few of these areas, since the ordinance as a whole clearly includes some best practices garnered from around the country and does a good job addressing many of these issues. The ordinance contemplates board members being appointed by the city council and the mayor. It could be strengthened by requiring that a majority of appointees are nominated by local civic organizations. And that's obviously to ensure the independence of the board, but also to increase the legitimacy, its legitimacy in the eyes of the city's residents. To be effective, the board must have a broad scope to review complaints, and this ordinance achieves that in section 2-16.9. One suggestion is to add discriminatory behavior on top of what the ordinance mentions when it says slurs relating to race, expression, sexual orientation, and disability. We've heard a lot about the necessity of having subpoena power, and this is something that ACLU agrees is important, including the ability to subpoena internal police disciplinary documents and to compel people to testify. A common failing of civilian review boards across the country is that they have focused exclusively on individual cases. This is another point I think that has been brought up by our panelists. That we need to address the systemic failings of police department policies and practices. And the civilian review board must have the ability to review underlying practices that lead to civil rights violations. So the key here is ensuring that the board is not just looking at individual cases, but really at trends. And this has been achieved in some other jurisdictions, sometimes by including an inspector general, whose job it is to look for patterns of many complaints and investigate those if those are the result of a policy shift or an unwritten policy. So we don't necessarily need the position of a so-called inspector general. It looked like in New York, the senior advisor has many policy people under senior advisors also looking at reviewing data, so that responsibility could be included there. I think it is advisable to have this ordinance explicitly mention that review and suggesting improvements to police department policies and practices does fall under the purview of this board. The problem with policing is it's often not just individual officers, but a culture of the institution that creates problems. And to the extent the institution allows for individual officers to be engaged in racially disparate policing practices, it's important that the board's authority covers not only the acts of the individual officers, but the overall culture and processes of the department. It's in this context, I'm a little concerned that while the ordinance requires that the rates of complaints be tracked and publicly reported, it does not explicitly say that the records will be analyzed and examined for racial disparities, with the intent of allowing the board to make these policy recommendations to reduce disparities. One area in particular that stands out is The public reporting of the BPD statistics section, that's 2-16.12, section 8, doesn't include mention of race there, even though race is mentioned previously when we're talking about some of the data that the board is
What was the citation?
Excuse me?
The citation?
2-16.12, section 8. So that's the part that's
you.
talking about the information we posted on the website for the public. And the ACLU has done a lot of work to try to get a hold of public data on stop and frisk broken down by race and have it reported publicly. And then, finally, this is another issue that came up before, but timeliness of complaints. The ordinance contemplates limiting the ability of the aggrieved individuals to file complaints to 6 months. And we're just concerned about how that works for people who may have a pending criminal case against them. I think that's a good solution. We heard from some other jurisdictions of let that clock start after that case is resolved. And then finally, there's a lot of good measures in the ordinance about public transparency. The ordinance mentions monthly quarterly public meetings. Those could be potentially held as often as monthly. We want to make sure they're open sessions where residents can raise concerns, and of course, it's got to be easy to file those complaints. So those are our recommendations overall. And I'm standing in for ACLU Racial Justice Director Rasan Hall, who's on a well-deserved vacation, but he is also available in the long term to work with the council to look at this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Darwin available? He might be running late. I will check. Youth advocate. Just checking real quick if he's in the waiting room. Darwin? Okay. Might be conflicted. Okay, well, if Eddie Crispin is available?
I am.
Hello.
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, rather. We started in the morning.
Yeah.
You ready? So good morning, everyone. Thank you for those who have taken part in creating this this legislation, to those who have presented. So first and foremost, I think I'm happy that I was allowed to be part of this this hearing, because too often over the last few months, we've heard a lot of conversation around police legislation reform, and we've not been part of the conversation. So I'm always happy and thankful when I'm allowed to be part of the conversation. So I think for most officers, and I know the ones that I've spoken to that I represent at Mamleo, their biggest concern is that there is some context and insight given to those who are going to be part of this civilian review board. Policing is one of those things that we most people see from the outside, and until you take part in it, all too often people don't understand the things that we do and why we do it. So it's absolutely crucial that people have context and insight into how we do our job and why we do the things that we do. And it looks like the ordinance speaks to that in terms of training. So I'm thankful for that. And I think the other issue as far as is impartiality. When appointing the people who are going to be on the civilian review board. I think over the last few months, we've seen a lot of people who have clearly demonstrated and expressed negative attitudes and disdain for police officers. So I get that those people may be angry and frustrated by some of the stuff they've seen, but I think it's also important that we don't allow people who have clearly expressed wide-ranging disdain for police to be on this board, and that I don't know that those individuals can truly be objective. So I think for me, as a member of law enforcement, also as a Black man who's a father of 2 Black sons, I think I understand the need for reform in policing. And we are very happy to be part of the conversation because, like I said, all too often, not only are we left out of the conversation as police officers, but as Black men who walk through life primarily as Black men. And I think all too often people see police officers being anti-reform. We welcome reform. We want it to be fair and impartial and deal with the issues that we see as being problematic in policing. So we support the reforms. So my concerns have been based on some of the research I've done. And I know the Globe came out with an article a few months ago, and there was a lot of complaints about the percentage of IAD complaints that are sustained. When I did research, it seemed like 11%, somewhere around 10 to 12% seemed to be the national average in terms of complaints that was sustained. So if any of those individuals from either Cambridge or New York, Ms. Alvarez from New York, could speak to the percentage of complaints that was sustained, I'd be happy to hear that. I think, you know, the other piece is that there's a lot of concern about officers' due process rights in terms of their ability to appeal to the findings from the findings of the Civilian Review Board. I think it's absolutely crucial. We know that due process is a big part of our rights in this country. So I don't think police officers should be entitled to any less due process. And I think the other main issue for me has been this issue of money, because there's been a big push towards divesting some money from police officers. And I think we also have to be mindful about how quickly we can get these services engaged that are going to take over some of the roles that police officers have been playing for the last probably longer than community policing has existed. A big part of community policing is this idea that we are supposed to partner with other city agencies and find solutions. So I'd be interested to find out where that's going to come. And then the other issue that just came up was this idea of discriminatory behavior, which oftentimes is perception rather than reality. Last week, we saw a huge parade on Talbot Ave. And I spoke to it beforehand. I had a conversation with the community activist. I said, the first thing that happens when we go there to break up these huge gatherings, somebody alleges discrimination, right? And sure enough, the next day, there were some community members who said, well, the Boston police doesn't care about Black folks. Not thinking about the alternative would have been for us to go in there heavy-handed, and the response would have been, look, the Boston police, look at how they respond to Black folks as opposed to how they've responded to other incidents. So I think we have to be mindful of that. And then, so again, discriminatory behavior and perception is huge, because oftentimes just because somebody feels something, it doesn't mean it's based in fact. I've been called racist by people who I am probably a lot less racist than they are. So we have to be mindful about what kind of processes we put in place to allow some of these complaints to be filtered out so that this agency doesn't become overwhelmed. I think Ms. Alvarez spoke to the idea that complaints were up substantially, and it slows down how quickly they're able to process some of these complaints and concerns, if you will. So absolutely. And I think the other piece is this idea of how long we should allow cases to come in, how long after the fact. That's something we'll have to take a look at. But I think, again, if you are filing your case to the Civilian Review Board and you have a criminal matter pending, I would assume that would be a non-issue. The Civilian Review Board could still look at all the facts and circumstances without any bias as to whether or not you have a criminal case pending. So I will stop there. If anybody has any questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you. We're just going to go ahead I see a hand raised from Mina. If it's okay, Mina, we're going to go ahead and have Dave Hernandez go first, and then we'll have you. Okay? So, Dave?
Good afternoon. How are you guys today? Thank you for having us. As Eddie said, it's really important for us to be part of this conversation as officers. First and foremost, we are civilians of the city. You know, we're citizens of the city of Boston. Eddie and I both grew up here for the most part. And so I am very grateful to be able to be part of this conversation. I'll just start off by saying, like, I understand that for generations, there has been a lot of mistrust with police, specifically in communities of color, which is why we are where we are right now. and having conversations like this and being part of this is so important. Like Eddie said, we want to be part of the change. We believe that change needs to happen because there has been a lack of change for so long. It has put us into the position that we are right now as a community where change is absolutely needed. I think that for a long time, at least as long as I've been on and since Eddie has been on as well, we felt voiceless as people of color inside of the department. And now for a good part of this conversation, we felt very voiceless as police officers and community members. So I'm glad to be here now. I think one thing that we have to take into account when we're talking about the Civilian Review Board is that we don't reinvent the wheel. I think it's important to work with like the co-op board or the ombudsman panel to try to make sure that we're not reinventing things. I feel like, so me personally, I've started working in the nonprofit sector with Jago, and then separately working with homeless and hunger awareness. And I find that oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, we have these, and I'm sure you guys have all worked with it, but you have all these organizations that are trying to do like their ultimate goal is the same thing, but they're all working separately. So it's almost like they're working against each other because they want either the credit or they want the funding, which is obviously a big thing in the nonprofit sector. So I think it's important that we don't try to reinvent something that's already there. Instead, we could just work together to make it better. So that's that. And then to get right into the Civilian Review Board, just some of the things that I noticed, again, with like the statute of limitation, I think that 6 months is a long time. I like what they're doing in Cambridge when it's 30 days. In Boston, our cameras at minimum are set to be deleted at 30 days. So if there is a statute of limitation, that's 6 months. Now there's evidence essentially that has been removed from, let's say, an issue with use of force. Well, use of force, I guess, are a little bit longer, but let's say it's a verbal, like a verbal issue. Now, let's say that someone comes in and says, oh, well, this police officer said this, and now it's a he said, she said thing versus just taking what's on camera and being able to use that for proof for both sides. So I think that's important to look at for the statute of limitation. Maybe looking at it from a perspective of it depends on what the complaint is. I think, thank you for New York City for coming in today. I think it's great what they're doing over there. It's like everyone has said so far, we are clearly behind the times. And so I think they've done a pretty great job so far. But again, as Brian was saying earlier, we are very different here in Massachusetts and in the city of Boston. I believe that if we work together, we can really combat these issues that we truly do have. And it's not to say that as a police officer, I see them internally. As a person of color, I see them externally. So I know that we have these issues, but I think that the biggest thing that we have here in Boston is that we are such a small city with a neighborhood feel. And we are 1 or 2 degrees of separation from policing, from city councilors, from businesses. So I think that we have a unique opportunity to really be an example for the rest of the city. And I think that, or excuse me, for the rest of the country. And I really think that we should take that into account. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, and obviously open to any questions and hoping to continue working with all of you.
Thank you. And I had Nina, is that by any chance maybe Darwin who raised their hand, but you're under sign in? Hi.
Yeah, I'm here, sorry.
Are you Darwin?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you.
So hi, my name is Darwin Saravia, and I'm a student in Boston. And I want to thank Councilor Mejia for inviting me to be here. I feel really privileged to be here representing the youth of Boston. So I want to go right into the way this ordinance could possibly change the lives of so many young people in Boston. I've grown up in Black and brown communities all of my life, and I'm no stranger to the fear that the police instill in these communities. From the shocking videos on social media to the brutal experiences lived by many young people in these communities, it begins to seem like the people meant to protect you are working against you. There have been many sleepless nights worrying for the lives of loved ones. My friends have told me countless stories about being mistreated by the police, and they always seem to stick with me. When a young person experiences mistreatment from the police, it creates this image in their head of what the police is like, and they go on forever changed by these experiences. Young people often have a hard time finding their voice. It can be so hard speaking up when it feels like the whole world is against you. Many situations leave young people feeling powerless, like they have no one to turn to and no one that cares about the trauma that they've endured. Not to mention that they have to go to school where there are most likely officers patrolling the hallways. Youth already have bad experiences with police, then have to go into safe spaces and relive that trauma. This ordinance creates the opportunity for these stories of injustice to be heard. It gives hope to all of the young people who feel like they don't have a voice in justice, and it creates a way to ease the tensions between police and communities. That is all from me. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming, and your testimony is wonderful. So we're going to do what we did before. We'll ask that all the panelists and speakers stay on, and the city councilors will take some time and ask you all some questions. For those of you who, again, we have a hard stop in order to give central staff a break, and also to help our, as we gear up for a 3 o'clock hearing. So what we're gonna do is, again, be strict with our time and questions for each one of my colleagues. So we'll start again at the top with Councilor Andrea Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panelists for being on this panel. And frankly, thank you guys for being a little bit more patient as we got through panel 1. I always think we want to respect people's time, but your voice is absolutely valued in this space, including our young people, Darwin. So thank you so much for being here. Madam Chair, I know we're in a hard stop. I engage with the folks offline with respect to this as well. So I'm going to turn my time over to my colleagues who have had less time to do that. So I'll turn it over to them now. Thank you, Madam Chair, just to be mindful of the time.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia?
Yes, thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to the panelists and a big shout out to Eddie and his crew and all the police officers who are deeply rooted in this community and go hard every single day, understanding that they're battling inside and outside when it comes to the political climate. So we really do see you and appreciate you. And I know it is often really difficult to be juggling these two worlds, but do appreciate your leadership and voice in this space always. So thank you for being here. And to you too, David, for informing a lot of the conversations that we've had over the last month or two that Councilor Campbell has convened. And a big shout out to Darwin too, because he's an urban scholar and a young student here in the city of Boston. And so my first, it's always hard to speak your truth, even sometimes when your voice quivers, but we are fully of the mind that young people are the ones that are living these realities in many ways and should be front and center. And so really do appreciate you stepping into your power and being with us here today. So my question is going to start off with you, Darwin. If you could tell me, there's been some conversation about whether or not young people should actually have a seat at the table and whether or not youth should be a part of the actual civilian review board. So I would just be curious to hear from you. Right now, the age that we're proposing is 18 to 21 to be fit to serve on the board as a voting member, which means that you would not only just be in the seat, you would actually have an opportunity to vote. And so there's been some questions about what would be the appropriate age. And I'm just curious, what do you think would be the age that's mature enough to sit on this board? And can you tell us why or why not? Do you think 18 to 21, is that mature enough? Do you think that we should be looking at 21 to 25? Like, what are your thoughts?
I definitely think that it's important to have youth in these kind of things, because if we're expecting these people to lead us in the future, then we need to prepare them to lead us, and we need to have them in these conversations to be able to prepare them for, taking up the jobs that will soon be vacant. And I think 18 to 25 to 21 would be a good age to start.
And so given your testimony, and there are a lot of young people who already have some fear, or they may feel like, they already are walking into the space with some biases about like their own personal lived experience. Like, what type of training would you think in preparation would young people need to be able to sit in this space?
I think definitely training with learning how to handle situations that learning how to handle situations of like de-escalation and like all of that, because sometimes it gets a lot when you're a young person and you're trying to, grow and like teach more people about stuff. And I think that a lot of the time when we're trying to teach young people about police, it can get really skewed, especially now because of all of the, bias that young people have towards the police because of social media, because of the news, because of, etc. So I think that just training on, I don't know, like being with the police and kind of seeing how they operate and trying to understand them and trying to just join those two forces, so then you can better, feel more comfortable to work with them.
Thank you for that, Darwin. I'm going to go on now to my questions for Matthew Allen, and for Edwards, you'll be happy to know this is my last question. Is that okay? It's just, or am I already at my time?
Please just make this your last question.
Sure. So Matthew, the issue of trust keeps coming up, and people have a hard time trusting the government, especially trusting in the police. Feels like a all-time low. And how can we get people to trust that this board is actually going to look out for them?
That is what I spoke to with the community nominating process. If there is a way to involve civic organizations and in nominating members of the board, so that it's clear that this is not just a bunch of figureheads. I know that would not be true even if the council nominated everyone, but it's a matter of appearance being reality in politics. I believe Atlanta, Baltimore, and Newark all have boards where there is some community organizations, some civic organizations involved in that process. And I think there will be, when this board is up and running and we're able to have those periodic quarterly, if not monthly, public sessions where people are able to speak and these statistics are presented, that's also going to go a long way towards building trust in the community. As you know, and as I mentioned, the ACLU has worked for years to get the Boston Police Department to regularly publish their stop and frisk data. We got it a few years ago after threatening lawsuits, and then it was supposed to be published regularly. Still has not gone up regularly, so we're looking into that again. So I think that is, along with what Yvonne cited, the issue with the link being down right now on the complaint process. Before, the link was not down, but it still says commend. The link says commend an officer, not complain. So that's also kind of misleading, I think, to the community. So I do think this board is definitely a step in the right direction, and with those policies in place to involve the community and increase transparency, that's gonna help build and heal relationships with the community.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and I just want to let you know that Councilor Arroyo is in the house.
I know. Councilor Flaherty, and then Councilor Arroyo, if you wanted to kind of give some brief thoughts and questions and whatnot. Councilor Flaherty?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No questions at this time. Just want to thank the panel members for their time and attention, and was interested in their thoughts and comments.
Thank you. Councilor Arroyo?
Thank you, and I apologize for being late. I had a small family situation. I'm gonna go ahead and look over the tape on what I missed. I see that is this panel 2 or panel 3?
This is 2 and 3.
Oh, 2 and 3 together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you can give me a second just to get myself settled, and then I'll call you right back. I'll then, if you call on me, I'll then go. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Bach? Oh, excuse me, Councilor Braden, my apologies.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I just had one quick question that we touched on briefly. You know, there's a lot of data being collected, especially in New York. I was wondering if the data is actually being used to inform changes in policy or training methods within the department in New York. As a sort of a feedback loop, is there a feedback loop that will analyze the data and then help inform practice to improve policies and procedures?
Is
she still here?
She might be gone. She may have gone.
Yeah. Well, that's just a question. We can follow up another time. I'm sorry I have to jump off for another call, but thank you so much. This has been very informative. Thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think I have further questions at this time. I just really want to thank the panelists, especially thank Officers Crispin, and I'm so sorry, I've just forgotten. Anyways, I thank them so much. Yes, Officer Hernandez, thank you for joining us. And just, I really want to say, I feel very encouraged by the specificity of the New York example today, and the opportunity to really think through what it looks like and what it looks like at scale, right? For a city that's way, way bigger than ours. I think, you know, that this question of how to make sure that any discipline, whether civilians are involved in it or not, has purchase, is still a real critical issue here for us in Boston. And I also just want to add that I really echo Councillor Edwards's perspective about, you know, the fact that reality is creating anything new here needs the cooperation of the administration and this council together. And I really hope that we can figure out how to do that. And I think I just want to underscore, it's come up a lot, the fact that this is a conversation we've been having for a while. I was Googling something a few days ago and found an article where Wayne Budd was recommending a civilian review board for the Boston Police Department 29 years ago in 1991, and being criticized at the time by the Patrolmen's Association for that recommendation. And I just think that we have to get off a merry-go-round and really make some forward progress here. So I hope that's something that we can do together in the coming weeks and months. So thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. From Councillor Janey to Councillor Splin and Councillor Sabi George, if you don't have too many questions, would it be okay for her to be able to jump in to make her 1:30? Please, thank you. Councillor Janey, very brief.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I apologize, my laptop died, so I missed part of the presentation for this second panel, but really just wanted to extend my gratitude and appreciation for everyone's work, this panel, the last panel, the makers, my colleagues, and you, Madam Chair. I do have to run for a 1:30 call, and I appreciate my colleagues, Councillor Flynn and Councillor Sabi George, for letting me go out of turn. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Up next is Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards, and to the makers as well. I also want to say thank you to the panelists for their informative comments on this important topic. I want to thank Officer Crispin as well for his leadership on so many issues in our city. Just one point I wanted to highlight. I listened to the young person talking about, you know, the distrust many young people have in the city, and that might be true, but I think it's important for all of us to also address that issue. And, you know, from my experience being in the neighborhood so often, on the weekends especially, you know, the police do incredible work in our city in helping people, whether it's on Mass Ave or it's on Moakley, it's in Moakley Park, or it's in the downtown area, or it's in Dorchester or Roxbury. But I think sometimes we don't know about the great stories as well about all the police that are in our neighborhoods trying to build positive relationships with so many people and young people especially. But as we have this conversation, I also think it's important to highlight how we're going to continue building bridges and building relationships between our police officers and our young people in our city. I want to say thank you to Councilor Edwards and the makers as well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panelists in this round. And just want to commend the makers and the chair for bringing together sort of all of the voices that need to be represented in this conversation. I will say it took just sort of a moment for me when I think it was Officer Hernandez talked about not being included both in conversations as a man of color, as a resident in this city, as a person of this city, but then also as a police officer. And I know that Eddie has made reference to that in some of his comments, that when we do this work, in order for this work to be successful, we need to make sure that all of the parties are accounted for and that we're making sort of that room at the table for those voices and for that effort, because it will not be a successful effort if we aren't all sort of involved in this work together. So I do appreciate the sort of the thoroughness of the diversity of those that are here in the discussion today. But I think, and Councillor Flynn alluded to this or sort of directly said this, that it is important that our members of the Boston Police Department are also included in this, because the policies need to be effective and impactful. And I think certainly their opinion and their thought and their constructive criticism of anything that is put together is important to understand and to note for that work to be successful. So I think that having my message here right now is just to thank the makers and the chair for making sure that we have the diversity of opinion at the table. And in particular, I want to note that Officer Hernandez has been heard and his commentary has been heard as well. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's it for me.
Thank you very much. I think Councillor Baker just confirming you had no questions. And then Councillor Arroyo, if you wanted to say something now, feel free. I see Eddie Crispin has raised his hand as well. And then I'll just say some concluding remarks.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank the panelists. I figure if everybody's signing off at this point, it's 1:30, it started at 11, that I probably don't have a question that hasn't been asked already. And so I'll just rewatch the tape. But I do want to thank the panelists for being here, especially our officers, for taking time out of the day to be at this. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you, sorry again, Eddie Crispin, you raised your hand.
I did. Just run real quick comment before we end up. Again, thank you for allowing me to be part of this hearing. I just wanted to point out, I know too often over the last few months, we've pulled. When I say we, I think people who are in the public space, some legislators pull from people who have very adverse interactions with the police. I know over the summer, the Boston Police Department, myself included as part of the community service office, ran a number of programs for young people. I have yet to hear anybody mention those, nor were any of those individuals who often talk negatively about us ever reached out to us to come and talk to these young people. So I think it's important when we talk about, absolutely there is need for change, but we need to be mindful that we don't always pull those people with negative opinions of the police. We do a ton of programming. We reach out to thousands of kids across the city on a regular basis, thousands, who would tell you about the positive impact we've had on their lives. I have letters, emails, cards I can show. It's important that when we have these panels, we don't just necessarily pull from those people who have been negatively impacted by the police. I go to community meetings all week, and I know oftentimes when I hear people in these public spaces talk negatively about the police, but those same people reach out to us when they need things in the community. It's important that we have those voices heard. Unfortunately, most of those people who are in the medium, right? Those people who get up every day, go to work, come home, and rely on the Boston Police to make sure that they can go outside with their kids, that they can walk through their hallways, those people necessarily, their voices are not necessarily being heard, because guess what? When they come home, they're busy getting their family ready, get ready for work the next day. Those are important voices we need to hear. I get it. We need to do the work, but we also need to be mindful about a large, probably the majority of the population who don't have negative perceptions of police. We need to hear those voices, and we need to do things that will minimize their concerns on an everyday level. Things such as public safety, that they can come in their house without having 10, 20 people sitting on their stairs. Because guess what? When that happens, those individuals who criticize the police are not there. When you walk down Nubian Square and people complain about groups of 10, 15, 20 young people, drug addicts, who are shooting up, who are smoking crack right there in the public eye, nobody sees that but the police. So I just wanted to end off on that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, but I think too often people want to focus and pull in those voices who just talk negatively of the police. And I get it, we have to have those voices, but I have yet to hear anybody pull in somebody who has said anything positive about the police. And those people, I would venture to say, outnumber those who have the negative perception of the police. I will end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, I had mentioned before our proceeding next steps. I'm just going to review them and quick summaries of the discussion points for this ordinance. Before I go into that, I did want to address and make sure people understand the point of this ordinance and civilian review board. This is not a question of good or bad police. This is a question of open or transparent process. And for many people, the current process is not bringing that. This is not a question. This is not questioning how hard police officers work, that they put their lives on the line. This actually has not, majority of police officers most likely will have nothing to do with the civilian review board, because as Officer Crispin put out, many of them just do want to protect people and go home. But this is not about then judging how they do their jobs. This is a question of whether, when they don't do their jobs, those particular individuals don't do it, how do we make sure to gain the public trust and create a process, right, that assures that the system will actually work to protect people and to repair that. That's how I see the Civilian Review Board or co-op and whatever suggestions that we have to that today. It's about process, transparency, and building public trust when police officers don't do their job. We're not questioning if they do their job. So again, to the list of things that will be discussed, most likely in a working session, the language, we had subpoena powers, independent structure, independent access, disciplinary recommendations, language access, appointment powers from the mayor, the city council, and as Matt Allen mentioned, possibly city or civic groups, data, making sure that we have constant and consistent data collection, demographic for the police and the folks who are filing the complaint. We wanted to make sure that we knew where the money, how much it's going to cost to make this truly effective, and also where that money is going to come from. Fair question, considering we're looking at a decrease in some of our income. Audit powers, I think Matt Allen mentioned. And also, one thing I think is worth mentioning and considering is when it comes to young people who might be filing a concern, and they would have to go to first confess or talk to their parents. There's a layer of trust, and we don't know what the person was up to, that they may have been in a situation. I think we should consider a longer period for younger people, for children basically, about whether they should come forward. So, and how we look at the statute of limitations. And to add also to the list from the officer, Eddie Crispin, who we pull from and their perceptions of the police matter, whether they're all negative or whether they're all positive or whether they're just completely neutral. And making sure that we pull from a perspective that is not solely anti-police, and whoever's pulling and looking at the structure that we create. I am going to conclude this hearing. Again, most of us have another hearing coming up, which will very likely last another 2 to 3 hours. And so I see your hand is raised, Officer Crispin. I don't know if this is from before or if you're raising it again, but it's from before, right? Okay.
It's from before.
Okay, great. So with that, I will, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this hearing. There will be a working session that comes up and looks at these points. We are accepting testimony all the time. So thank you so much for everyone who's participated. Have a good afternoon.
You have to gabble us. You have to gabble us, right? Or no?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for a great hearing.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.